Hi, this is probably the last Wireshark video that I'm going to do. We've covered some of the topics of interest, but the one thing that we have not talked about is how do we acquire the packets? So you say, well, okay, I've downloaded Wireshark, I've sniffed my network, I've captured packets, but when we are either doing a penetration analysis, which we do quite a bit if we're red teaming in cybersecurity, or if we just want to monitor somebody to capture data as far as what's going on with an attack, it's not usually going to be our machine doing it. It's going to be another machine that is hooked into the network. And so how do we get that data? And that's what we're going to talk about today. There's a few different ways. There's a thing out there called a hub, which is the best and the worst case scenario, because if it makes it very easy to capture packets, but heaven forbid if your network has them, because they're pretty antiquated. So if you remember, the whole deal with a hub is anything that goes in one port on the switch or one port of the hub, it leaves all ports. It does not do MAC learning, and so basically your traffic, all traffic is exposed to everyone on the hub. They're also very low speed. They're 10/100 megabits per second, and they are half duplex. And so basically they are not only very insecure, but also they are just a huge bottleneck for the network, which is why you don't find them anymore. However, if you want to go in and intercept traffic, you're going to have to figure out some way to get in between the workstation you want to sniff and the switch it's connected onto. And if you can get in there and unplug the workstation from the switch and insert a hub in between it and the switch, then you can use the natural bad characteristics of the hub to capture that traffic. But if it's in a modern network, you're now changing it to a half duplex network, you're probably down speeding it to maybe 100 megabits per second, if hopefully they have auto negotiation turned on. And boy, even just finding a hub, I looked on eBay, and things that came up when you would search for hub were actually switches. They just called them hubs. So it's an option. It's just a horrible option. So what else can we do here? Well, okay, so I mentioned, we moved from hubs to switches because switches were inherently more secure. That's what you're going to find in today's networks, in broadcast domains. If you don't find routers, you're going to find switches. The switches are 10 or 100, 1,000, and 10,000 megabit per second, being 10 gig. They are full duplex, so we have much better speed. We don't have the constraint of half duplex, send response kind of a thing. But the problem is, and one of the reasons we put the switches in is because they restrict the traffic that is going to your workstation to be only the traffic that belongs to your workstation. And so that's going to be direct unicast, broadcast, and multicast traffic. Well, the point of this whole thing is to get traffic that doesn't belong to your workstation. And so, so now the switches, for all their advantages, become a problem when we're trying to go in there and monitor other people's traffics. Most of the switches you'll find in enterprise networks have got something called either port mirroring or port spanning. Cisco calls it span. So this requires access to the switch. You have to have physical access to the switch because you have to plug your machine into an unused port of the switch. You also need administrative access to the switch because you have to issue commands on the CLI. And so so as far as red teaming, unless they are just completely insecure and they let you into their wiring closets, and then somehow you figure out how to compromise the password, this is not really for a red team kind of environment. This is more where you want to go in and watch traffic. You have the legitimate need to go in there and surreptitiously monitor traffic. And so the spanning on Cisco, we're going to talk about Cisco now. That's usually what you'll find. They support source ports. They will also source VLANs and destination ports, so you can specify it down to the VLAN. A couple of variations. We have just the span, which is switch port analyzer, and that restricts you to analyzing within one switch. So you have to plug into the switch that you want to to span. Remote span, and I don't know how many vendors do this, but Cisco allows you to monitor switches that are not, that your sniffer is not directly connected to. So basically, you look it up to configure this, but you have a monitored port and you have a monitoring port. So the monitored port is the port that you want to sniff, and the monitoring port is a port that you plug your machine that's running Wireshark into. So anyway, there's another device called a tap, and a tap is a physical device, and you physically interrupt the connection, sort of like inserting a hub, like I talked about at first. You put it on the wire between the workstation that you're monitoring and the switch they're connected to. So once again, we have a problem here that we need physical access, right, to one end of the cable, probably the one at the switch side, because you're not going to be at the person's desk trying to hook this thing up. You are interrupting the connection when you place the tap, right? So somebody could potentially notice. It could act as a bottleneck on a busy network, depending on the network speeds and the type of tap you're using. You could be offering telltale signs that something is going on, which we don't want to do, of course. And once again, depending, like one of those telltale signs, besides just an interrupt while you're unplugging and plugging the thing in, as quickly as you can. Depending on how the ports are configured and what kind of a tap you're using, you could also then downspeed the network, maybe all the way down to 100 megabits per second. So once again, it's a tell that we probably don't want. Couple of tap options. We have the throwing star. Basically, I mean, this is as basic as it gets, because full duplex, you've got a pair that you're transmitting on in one direction and then receiving on the other side, and a pair that you're transmitting on in this direction and receiving on the other side. And all they're doing is they're just physically wiring to this pair of transmit and sending it out one of the Ethernet jacks, and this pair of transmit and sending out the other Ethernet jack. And they're bridging onto it, really. And no, this requires your machine to have two ports on it, two Ethernet ports. If you're using a laptop, you might not even have one Ethernet port, in which case you're going to have to get a USB dongle that offers two Ethernet connections. And yeah, this is pretty basic. It kind of what can I say? It's, if you don't have anything else, the dongle will cost you another 15 or 20 bucks. So for 20, 30 bucks, you can see what tapping a network is like. A little better option is an active tap, and essentially this acts as, this gives you the two Ethernet interfaces. One goes towards the switch, one goes towards the device that the workstation you're monitoring. If they have, this one happens to support power over Ethernet, which is a good thing, because a lot of companies have SIP phones, and those phones use power over Ethernet. So this passes through the power over Ethernet, so that by you going in into monitoring, they don't lose their phone connectivity, which would be a real tell. Powered by USB, will go up to 1,000 megabits, so it'll go up to a gig, and it's a pretty good choice. I mean, it could act as a bottleneck still. But for probably most people watching, and if you work in a corporation, you're probably going to buy a much nicer one. You can spend thousands of dollars on these things. And this is Ethernet. I mean, this is Cat 5. So if or Cat 5, Cat 6. So if you are a fiber optic, you're going to need a fiber optic tap, and those are real expensive. So anyway, so the active tap. Well, so let's say that we are red teaming, and we don't have physical access to the switch or the wiring closet, and we still want to capture traffic. Well, there's a software package called Ettercap, which performs a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, there's lots of man-in-the-middle attacks. This happens to do something called ARP spoofing. Essentially, it sends out gratuitous ARPs and which are ARPs that have not been requested, and it tells the workstation that its MAC address is the default gateway. So all of a sudden now the workstation says, oh, hey, wait, I've got a new default gateway, and it's actually your sniffing machine. And at the same time, it informs the default gateway that the sniffing machine's MAC address is actually the workstation's MAC address. So now the default gateway goes, oh, any packets I want to send to that workstation, I will send to your sniffing station. And actually then your in Linux, there is an IP forward command that it automatically executes, and it brings the frame in and then sends it right back out again. And so it's essentially retransmitting the frames in both directions. So you can see it could be a bottleneck, depending on the speed of your machine, depending on the amount of traffic on the network. But it's a pretty cool solution. And as I'm sure that all of you either have Kali on a live stick, have a machine that has been dedicated, an old laptop that's dedicated to Kali, or are running Kali as a virtual machine, that you have Kali running, because if you're in cybersecurity, you really should have Kali in some form or fashion. So this is it for that. So let's switch to Kali. So we're going to go here to Applications and Sniffing and Spoofing, and EtherCap is right here. And sniff, we have two sniffing options. One is unified sniffing, one is bridge sniffing. Now, honestly, I have never used bridge sniffing. I just use a tap. But bridge sniffing is basically if you have two Ethernet interfaces, it basically performs the same option as a tap. And I'm going to have to get my machine set up with a second Ethernet port and try that out. But we're going to do unified sniffing here, Ethernet 0, because our point here is that we're using this because we don't have access to that wire. So anyway, that is why we're doing it. There's a couple of things here. We're not going to look at all of the things that EtherCap can do. Going to do a quick scan. Look at scan for hosts. I got 23 hosts in the list. So if I look at the host list, and these are all of the hosts that EtherCap can see, and their MAC addresses. And this is a wired port going into a switch, and I become aware of all of these ports, or all of these other devices that are connected on. So that's pretty cool. So I want to sniff between a laptop that I have behind me here and my default gateway. And so the default gateway is 192.168.1.1, and I'm going to add that as target 1. And the machine behind me is 1.6, and I'm going to add that as target 2. And so if I look at my targets, here we have the two targets, 1.1 and 1.6. And so those are the targets that we're going to perform the man-in-the-middle attack on, the ARP spoofing on. But before that, let's go to Applications and Sniffing and Spoofing and start up Wireshark. And you can see Wireshark sees Ethernet 0. I got activity on Ethernet 0. And I'm going to start the capture here and let it run a little bit. And it's pretty normal. Not a whole lot going on. But we're interested in ARP, so I'm going to stop it and put an ARP filter on. And here 1.5 till 1.7. 1.7 is my machine, 243. I've got some virtual interfaces running on this thing too, but 1.7 is actually the machine that I'm running my virtual machine on. So that looks pretty normal. That's kind of what you would expect to see from running just running Wireshark on your interface that's connected into a switched network. So let's start another capture. And here, man in the middle, ARP poisoning, sniff only, okay. And you see here, we are ARP poisoning the victims. And go back to Wireshark. Go back to Wireshark. Okay, I saw a telltale there, so we'll stop it. If I remove the filter, the ARP filter there, we see some of the HTTP traffic that we saw. We saw some of the normal ARP traffic. And we see some TCP out of order. There's some things going on here that look a little weird. So let's filter for ARP. And so here we say that 192.168.1.6, if you remember, that is the MAC address of my laptop behind me, is at this Ethernet, or is this MAC address, Easy One Dogs Charlie. We also send out an ARP that says that 1.1, which is my default gateway, is at 08002766 Easy One Dog Charlie. You notice these two MAC addresses are exactly the same. So we are telling the network that these two IP addresses have both belong to this single MAC address. And you can see Wireshark is complaining here, duplicate address or use of 1.6 is detected. So if somebody is looking, they know. I mean, obviously, it's obvious. I mean, to the on a network level that something is going on here, because we're spoofing the ARP. We're doing a gratuitous ARP, and we're sending out false information, and so it is not like this is undetectable, but depending on how sophisticated their network monitoring is, you might be able to get away with it. But more interesting is if we'll start the capture up again, continue without saving, and I'm going to go around here and I'm going to ping -t. Okay, I'm doing continuous ping of Google. And here is where it gets cool. Took me a while to type it in. I guess I could have filtered for ping, right? Here we go. Here's 192.1 or 168.1.6 that is doing a query for google.com, and it's going out to 8.4. So it's going out to the internet. It's a DNS query, and I intercepted it, and I'm not part of that. I'm on a different port on this switch, and so and we got ping requests and responses coming on, and so basically I am intercepting the traffic on that switch, and I'm connected like a workstation. I do not have to have physical access to the switch. So anyway, that is Ettercap on Kali, and you ought to go out and play with it a little bit. It's a lot of fun. So Anyway, so I think that is probably the end of the Wireshark videos.